To welcome you to the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. This is the 9th in this series of activities of expert panels or public policy forums that we've had since 2014. We thought it was going to be the first one that was in conjunction with the Transportation Research Board meetings, but we had a pop-up forum on Monday with Uber. We're talking about what ride sharing means to last mile transit and accessibility. So we're very excited to have you all here. You're all special guests. I want to make sure that I note to you just how important this topic is to our communities, and that our elected officials have joined us today in this discussion about what can make BRT successful. Jay Fassett is also is on the Arlington County Board and chairs the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. Dave Schneider will be joining us shortly. He's the deputy mayor for Falls Church and is the immediate past chair. We're honored to have the chair of the Arlington County Board, Libby Garvey, and John Weistad, also with the Arlington County Board as well. So thank you for coming. We have a tradition here of introducing everyone in the room. And what we do is we ask you to introduce yourselves, tell us where you're from, and tell us one thing that you hope to learn about bus rapid transit today. And while you're thinking of that, I thought I would get things started by talking about what are the fundamentals from the transportation world's view about what makes something bus rapid transit, and what are those sort of definitions of success. These are codified in the federal statute, and they are the things that the Federal Transit Administration looks for. First and foremost, a majority of the route has to be dedicated right away. I think that is a fundamental question. Secondly, you need defined stations. You need traffic signal priority for public transportation vehicles. And you need, and this is, I always love lawyers and their drafting. Many of you know I am one of them. You need short headway bidirectional services for a substantial part of weekdays and weekend days. In other words, it needs to be good coverage all the time, both ways. We have a lot of people here with a lot of expertise. We have some special guests who are here because of TRB. We also have
it's on your list here, but
how could I forget John Faust? Because he's such a good friend that I forget. But John Faust is here from Fairfax County. And one of the things I would say is that BRT is something that is a solution being looked at across our jurisdictions. And as Mr. Faust evidences, Route 1 is a place that we're looking at BRT. We're also looking at BRT as an option on Route 7. We have BRT in Metroway in Alexandria. It will come to us on West End Transitway. It's being looked at as solutions in other places as well. As you'll learn from our speakers, bus rapid transit is also a solution that's being explored and moved forward on in Montgomery County. An important neighbor and an important part of the network of transit in the region. Why don't we start with you, Mr. Fassett, and if you reintroduce yourself and tell us what the one thing you're curious about in terms of bus rapid transit today.
Well, I'm on the county board in Arlington. I've been here at NVTC for a while. Served on a number of regional transportation bodies. I've always found the connection between land use and transportation actually fundamental to any region's success. And you know, the title of this it's very timely. I mean, obviously for our work in Crystal City, Potomac Yard, Alexandria, and then the questions about what's the maximum, what's the best level of bus service we can get on Columbia Pike, and how it relates to the discussion today will be very useful.
I'm going to take the privilege of introducing Dan, who's recently joined us. He heads up our Route 7 project and is an expert in his own right about how we make sure that bus rapid transit meets the demands of riders on the system. And I want to thank him and Mike Flood from Carson Freederhawk for putting this together today. Mike really was instrumental in sort of bringing us all together. And Mike will be talking about what elected officials need to be thinking about as they approach the decisions about bus rapid transit and implement those.
Okay, so I'm Tim Roseboom. I'm with the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. We're the state agency that funds capital and operating for our local transit systems here. And I guess maybe also by way of introductions, I managed a Route 1 study here between two jurisdictions in Northern Virginia that got put into our CLRP last year. As a bus rapid transit, and then Mike also wanted me to offer that in a previous life I had worked in Detroit on a light rail that is now being constructed as a streetcar, and what I want to learn, right?
Well, you're going to share with us your
so I'll still offer yeah, right. Where I'm working next. I want to hear what other states are up to, so I think that's appropriate for the panel.
Hi, I'm Jack Gonzalez with Parsons Sprinkerhoff. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I'm PB's National Director for Bus Rapid Transit. I've been doing it for the last 12 years, and I'm involved with projects across the nation, early planning stages and final design stages and operations. So I know how to design BRT, and I know how to put it into a constrained corridor. That's kind of like the hardest part sometimes. But what I want to learn is what do you consider a successful BRT project? Because I think everybody has a different level of what they think a success is for BRT operation.
So I'm Kate Mattice. I want to welcome you here to NVTC. I'm the Director of Programs and Projects. And so I'm just really glad that we could bring such a great group of experts, local experts and national experts on all things transit. One of the things that I hope to be able to lend to the conversation is somewhat how Tim said, the previous career. I had a previous career at the Federal Transit Administration. For over a decade I was there, and I worked on a number of the both developing and implementing the programs there, including the New Starts and Small Starts program. And I have a lot of experience in looking at what the different funding strategies can be for many of these programs. And I think that I probably will be echoed with the other folks talking here, but oftentimes it's a mosaic of funding that goes into all of these. And there's some interesting opportunities, I think, here in Northern Virginia, both with regional funding and with state funding. And there's also opportunities within the federal space if that's something that the region wants to be looking at. So I hope to be able to answer questions on that. So thank you.
I'm Cliff Henke with WSP Parsons Sprinkerhoff as well, out of the LA office. And I wear a couple hats in Parsons Sprinkerhoff as basically the global transit systems policy network, and I also have been involved with a variety of projects in BRT around the country, including LA, some of the projects that Jack has worked on as well. We work together also in Montgomery County on Joanna's project, and the CCT as well in Maryland. I want to learn a little bit more about what kinds of funding that you guys are thinking about with respect to BRT, and also some of the policy nuances that we can get into with respect to BRT, how it affects your notions about BRT. There are a couple of recent changes in the new FAST Act that we may want to talk about that make, I think, greater opportunities for BRT, so we can maybe get into that as well. And Kate and I have had conversations in her previous life about BRT and about eligibility issues with respect to BRT, so we can get into that as well.
Joanna Conklin from Montgomery County Department of Transportation. So I'm the Rapid Transit System Development Manager for the county, and so I'm the lead for DOT on Purple Line and all of the bus rapid transit projects that we have right now, all of which are being done by the state, but we have a big role as a coordinating agency. So we have been working on BRT for several years. Right now we have four projects going. We have the Quarter Cities Transitway, which is a 30% design, and it's been on the books for a long time, and it finally seems to be sort of moving, but there's no funding for construction for that project. We're funded all the way through design, but not for construction. portion. And then we're doing 3 planning studies on 3 of our corridors. Total, it's probably about 40 miles of BRT, and those are all in planning stages right now. But again, all funded just for planning, not for design, not for construction. So, you know, we have faced, I would say that many of the challenges we've faced so far in these projects sort of deal with, you know, funding. Where's the money going to come from? And our county executive has had some ideas on that. I'm sure we'll get into that later. Community buy-in has been a real challenge for us, so I'd be interested in if others have had experience in that. And just general process, because all of our BRT, except for the CCT, our other 3 are all on state roadways. So the state's actually leading the studies, but we have very strong opinions about, you know, what we want to do. And so I think the process has been a little bit of a challenge for us as well. So looking forward to talking about all of that.
My name is Michael Weinberger. I'm with Foursquare Integrated Transportation Planning, and I'm a consultant who works on a series of projects that are uniquely impacted by this topic. In my role working with the MPO and WCOG, we have supported the management of the Transitway of the Metro project and have seen that progress. We're doing a before and after study of that project and looking at where we're going to have improvements in efficiency and effectiveness of the service. We're also working on the piloting of transit signal priority on P7. So that study directly impacts a lot of the conversations on future BRT. For me personally, in terms of my area, as a practice area, I'm interested in learning more about the public involvement process. I know we're going to talk about informing the public, which is certainly important, but also if we have any time to shed light on involving the public, I'd also be interested to hear about that as well.
I'm Steve Yaffe. I work for Arlington County. I oversee the local fixed route fair transit park and stuff. My interest is, awkward here, not only the mechanics, but the explanation and how you integrate it when you have people transferring from local routes to the BRT. And whether it should be based at the station or some other way, as long as it's not on the bus.
Dennis Leach, also with Arlington County. I oversee the transportation programs. And we have a major interest in this topic. We're updating our 10-year transit development plan. Items like transit signal priority, off-vehicle fare collection, more lane dedication are all like central to that planning effort. And I think one of the things that we want to hear is how you work those issues at the regional level and reach resolution. When you have different localities running transit, operating signals, operating roadways, how do you broker the agreements that actually allows the region as a whole to move forward?
Lee Garvey, and I think first I'm really impressed with this. We're only not even halfway around the table, and this is a great group. I'm really impressed. I guess basically I'm interested in finding out how we can quickly get a regional BRT system up and running, and that even means going into Montgomery County. I think I learned about BRT from Mark Eldridge originally, a few years ago now. I guess I'm interested in how we can avoid getting hung up on the dedicated lane issue, because I doubt we can do that everywhere. And I think the gentleman from this worked in LA, I would be interested in hearing about that. I heard a little bit about how within 18 months you had 42 miles up and running, 20% increase in speed, 40% increase in capacity, and no dedicated lane. You're nodding your head. That to me is success.
It's on the down low.
Start.
Yeah, it's on the down low. That's the short answer.
John Weisstadt, Arlington County Board. I'm interested in BRT, not just from a transit perspective, but also from an economic development perspective. I know the literature has been mixed, but I was really cheered to see yesterday in Streets Blog USA, a new article headline, "New Evidence That Bus Rapid Transit Done Right Spurs Development." It was just done by the University of Arizona. And I'd like to know people's thoughts about that and the whole economic development angle.
I'm Al Hines, manager of Metro Bus Service Development, and I would like to hear more about what the vision for BRT is throughout the region and what Metro Bus can do to help fulfill that vision.
My name is Alan Pye with the City of Alexandria, the project manager for the West End Transitway, which is a BRT project that the city's advancing right now. One of the biggest things I'd like to learn and discuss is the financing side. There's different options out there and pulling it all together and getting something built.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eve Farmer. I'm also with the City of Alexandria. I was manager for the Crystal City Potomac Yard Transitway, aka Metroway. As we kind of brought that into implementation, a lot of coordination with Arlington County and WMATA. I'm actually interesting. I was going to say the general. I'm interested in hearing about kind of the challenges people have had in implementation, how they overcome them, blah blah blah. But I think one of the interesting things actually is this question of when you don't have a dedicated lane, what are the things you can do to really improve performance and reliability? And we've been lucky in Alexandria because of kind of the situations we've been in, for instance, on the Route 1 corridor, being able to kind of get that extra right of way and implement it pretty successfully in terms of maintaining the pedestrian environment. But how do you do that in kind of built out areas where you don't have that really, you can't expand the right of way, so what do you do there?
Hi, I'm Jim Slank. I'm also with the City of Alexandria. I've been working in BRTs for about 13 years in Alexandria, and then about 4 years when I was in Arlington. And basically, we did a lot of the work in terms of trying to get the funding for our Metroway when we were working on this thing. And I guess I continue to look for ways of funding BRT and helping Lee and Alan basically try to figure out the best ways of funding BRT. So I'd like to find out what FASTAC has to say in terms of BRT and what other people have discovered in terms of funding methodologies.
Hi, I'm John Faust. I'm in my third term on the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. As of yesterday, I became chairman of our Transportation Committee. Here because I've been interested in BRT long before I got on the board. Stu Schwartz going around his slide show. Specific issue I have and concern I have across Maryland, Montgomery County, and that is the American Legion Bridge. And from an economic development standpoint, we've made an enormous investment in Tyson's. We got great things going, and yet the Beltway getting out of Virginia is an absolute disaster at night, and it's going to eventually drag us down. And so my board and the Montgomery County board have been talking about the American Legion Bridge, and I see bus rapid transit as one of the tools that we should at least be looking at as a way to address that problem.
My name is Bob Moore. I'm with Fairfax County DOT, and essentially what I'm trying to do is start the implementation phase of the project that Tim talked about with getting BRT on Route 1, which is, of course, in Fairfax, as in most of Virginia, is a state highway. So there are significant coordination issues at the state level. And what I would really like to learn to begin with, amongst all the other things that we mentioned, I would like to know what lessons have been learned by others who have faced this daunting challenge of getting such a system up and running, funding, implementation, the whole 9 yards. What were the successes and what pitfalls to avoid?
I'm Randy White with the Fairfax County Department of Transportation. I'm the long-range planner for the Fairfax Connect bus service. And I'm looking forward to hearing about all the other things that I don't normally think about, because a lot of my emphasis is on how feeder bus service and BRT interact. Because I'm thinking about this specifically with regard to the Route 1 corridor, because there's a lot more people living in neighborhoods that are more than the quarter-mile buffer away from the corridor, that we need to find some way to get them to the stations so that they can use the BRT.
My name is Eric Titleman. I'm with the Fairfax County Department of Transportation, and I'm the division chief for capital projects. It's a team, a group that would be involved in my division. responsible for designing and implementing the BRT system on Route 1 from the Huntington Metro. It's about 11 miles down to Fort Belfort. So again, like my friends here, I'm interested in learning the successes and some of the challenges that I know we're going to face in implementing BRT on Route 1 and eventually Route 7. And it's coming our way as well.
I'm Joan Clark. I am the transportation aide for the Lee District Supervisor McKay's office. And he is unable to be here, so I'm here in his stead. We are, along with our friends here in Fairfax County, working on the Route 1 concept for BRT, but additionally, Supervisor McKay has a dream of BRT on Van Dorn Street coming out of Alexandria and going all the way to Kingstown. So I'm very curious about everything, the implementation, the process, the funding, and in particular, I guess, I'd love to hear about how BRT has been retrofitted into existing built-up community areas.
Harry Zimmerman, I'm Jeff McKay's representative to the Fairfax County Transportation Advisory Commission. So we deal with lots of different topics in the county on transportation. And I think what I'd like to hear more about, and you all have been talking about it with the dedicated lanes or not dedicated lanes, and your point about congested corridors, but how do you make the decisions about trade-off between BRT and displacing capacity on very important routes? So to me, that's an interesting trade-off mechanism.
I'm Pat Sullivan. I'm a reporter for the Washington Post, and I hope to learn some news this afternoon.
I promised you she would.
Hi, I'm Scott Pedowitz. I'm an Arlington County resident and frequent strap hanger, so I'm looking to hear how I might be able to get where I'm going faster.
Hi, my name is Nancy Iaconini. I am currently the chairman of the Arlington County Planning Commission, and in my past times with Arlington, I've also been chairman of the Transportation Commission, as well as chairman of WMATA's Riders Advisory Commission. I am here today to become better informed about BRT, particularly as it probably will inform our planning and transportation needs in 22202 as well as Columbia Pike. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so with my house literally having a trolley stop in its backyard. So I'm very familiar with public transportation and also with some bus rapid transit that Pittsburgh has been doing for years in a different way than I think will develop in Arlington. But nonetheless, something that is interesting for us to explore.
My name is Tom Burke. I'm also in the Fairfax County Department of Transportation team. I'm in the long range planning division section, and I'm on the Route 1 team working on looking at Van Dorn and looking at countywide where we might have long range BRT opportunities.
We are really glad to have you back.
Yes.
Welcome back.
So scared when you left.
I am Carol Mitten. I'm one of the deputy county managers in Arlington County. And I'm not a transportation professional, but I oversee the transportation function in Arlington, among other things. And many people have talked about working in a constrained environment where the dedicated lanes aren't possible. So I too am interested in figuring out, how can we build something that has many of the advantages of BRT, but maybe doesn't meet the pure definition, and so that we can move more people faster.
Hello, I'm John King. I'm also with Fairfax County Department of Transportation. I work in the same section as Tom, long range planning. I'm on the core team that is working on the MBOR, which is a comprehensive plan amendment for the Route 1 corridor. And I'm interested in learning about how BRT can interact and complement other forms of transit, Metro Rail or existing local bus service.
Hello, I'm Mary Murphy from Finley Horn and Associates. I'm a transportation planner and work with many of the current lead agencies in the term, including the town on the West End project right now.
Lacey. I am new to NVTC as a policy analyst. I just came from the Senate Banking Committee, working on the FAST Act, and so I'm looking forward to learning everything that I did not know about the other side of the FAST Act that affects you guys.
Hi, I'm Ella Claney. I'm with Strategic Consulting in WSP President's Brinkerhoff, and I'm working with Ann and Mike on the Route 7 project. So I'm interested in hearing about funding and financing for multi-jurisdictional BRT.
Eric Valley with the Arlington County Transportation Division, and here just interested to learn about the successes and challenges of other BRT projects.
Nancy Smith with the Northern Virginia Transportation Alliance. So many great things have already been said about things that I'm already interested in learning, but we'll say, interested in hearing if there have been any successes of, where we're unique in that we're not just one jurisdiction here, we're a region, and how if there have been success stories around the nation of integrating BRT as a multi-jurisdictional approach, and how that could be done without, as it's been suggested, taking away much needed existing capacity.
I'm Rob Whitfield with the Fairfax County Taxpayers Alliance, among other things. And I've been working on transportation issues, cost effectiveness for the last decade. Some 3 or 4 years ago, there was an article in the Examiner about the proposed BRT network in the Washington area, saying it would cost $70 billion over the next 20 years. So I called up the reporter to say, is that right, $70 billion? And I called Ron Kirby. I had a half-hour conversation with Ron, and sadly that was about 2 months before he was killed. So we never did get to the bottom of where is a BRT, where is it a good project, in the range of what bus alternative. And on Saturday I just met, when I was at the transportation camp for the social hour, I met Chris Conkler, VHB, who's involved with the Arlington County study, transit study. And again, the issues are what, for different parts of Arlington, where I grew up with double-deck buses starting at the age of 5. And so it just boggles my mind that double-deck buses have not yet been introduced into the Washington area. So I said to him, he said they're looking at articulated buses. So if BRT is just one of several bus alternatives, and we need to look at the hierarchy of bus alternatives to see what works best where.
All right, my name is Richard Price. Actually, I wear a couple of hats. I'm a commissioner on the Arlington County Transportation Commission. I'm also with the Coalition for Smarter Growth. We support Envision Route 7. We support BRT on Route 1. And in general, we support BRT, the use of BRT around the region, and find it that it's absolutely necessary that if you're going to implement BRT, that it must be the gold standard that has dedicated right-of-way, that is successful BRT. Now I'm here, and there's not been an issue that has been mentioned that I could come up with a new one, but I'm interested in all the issues that have been brought around the table.
And I'll end it, Lynn Rivers. I am with Arlington County with the Transit Bureau. I'm the WMATA Service Coordinator. I've been in the industry for almost 30 years. I know I look like I'm 30. But I've been in the industry for I've been in the industry for a long time. And what really interests me is from the planning side and from the operations side. From the planning side, we know what we see and what we expect the ideal is for BRT. But from an operations end, it takes quite a bit to ramp up to that ideal. So I'm interested in knowing from other successful BRTs how you might have phased it, some of the components. If you don't have right-of-way, what can you do? If you can't get TSP initially, what can you do? But ultimately to get to that ideal. But it takes a little while to ramp up to it.
So that was awesome. This is all gonna make Kate's job a lot easier. Let me circle back to where we started and that why there's this important federal definition. And it relates to one of the questions that you asked. Yes, there are many ways that the things we do for bus rapid transit could help other bus things, but if you want federal funding, you have to have 50% dedicated right away. That is a threshold question. And so You've already learned something. If you want New Start money or if you want other federal money, that's a piece of it. So what's gonna happen now is we're gonna hear from each of our speakers, and we're gonna ask them to tell us what they think is most important to making bus rapid transit successful from their experience. And Kate's gonna moderate this piece of it, and then she's gonna moderate what will surely be a very lively discussion to follow. I want you to know that we're going to sort of do a write-up of this and pull together resources from this that we will share with all of you. And then very quickly, we are also going to post just the raw video and raw audio so that if people want to listen to the conversation more quickly, then we can turn around a reference resource on it. So that will be coming. Kate.
So once again, we're just going to have our speakers tell a little bit more, dive into those important things, that the messages they want to share, and then open it up, and having the sort of the prerogative of being the moderator. Joanna, you're in Montgomery County, and so a lot of us are sort of familiar, and obviously there's some nexus to things that go on in Montgomery County that can go on in Northern Virginia. What are some key things that you'd like to share with the group?
Well, it's interesting, I think, to ask me what makes BRT successful, because we haven't actually implemented a BRT system yet. So Cliff, Cliff might be better suited to that. But I will say that we have been give you a little bit of kind of walk you through the history of how this has transpired in Montgomery County. We started studying this several years ago. DOT did a study of BRT in the county. The state did start maybe 3 years ago on 2 BRT studies on 2 corridors that we had identified early on that were important for us to look at BRT. And then in late 2013, our county council implemented the countywide bus transit corridors functional master plan, which is a long name for basically a master plan that identifies a network of about 10 BRT routes in the county. It's about 100 miles of BRT. And the idea wasn't that we were going to implement all of that at one time. Nobody ever thought that we would build 100 miles of BRT at one time, but the important thing that it did identify was what the corridors were and what the minimum right-of-way would be to build BRT in those corridors. And so going forward, what we're doing, and this goes towards the thought of having the dedicated lanes, is what allows us to do is, as developments come up along those corridors, they're reviewed by our planning department to see whether we need to ask for additional right-of-way from developers, so that at some point when we're ready to build, the dedicated lanes for the BRT, we hope that the right-of-way will be there. So on the Corridor Cities Transitway, which is the one that we have had in the planning stages for the longest amount of time, it's been on the master plan for many years, and at this point we have most of the right-of-way already there to go. So there's some minimal right-of-way that needs to be purchased for the project, but when we get to the point where it's ready to go, forward into more final design and construction, the right-of-way is not something that's going to be a big issue, at least we hope. The other corridors that we're studying are much more constrained. They're in the more urbanized areas of the county, Bethesda, Silver Spring, Wheaton, Rockville. So we're in a little bit of a different situation there. As we're going forward in the planning, we're realizing that right-of-way is challenging. The ultimate vision of the master plan is to be able to maybe build an additional lane or additional 2 lanes for the transit, but we just don't have that now. And the county's not really in a position to be purchasing significant amounts of right-of-way. So what we're having to look at is, do we look at these sort of interim? I heard somebody say that. Do we look at this sort of more phased approach where there's something that we can get in the shorter term that doesn't require as big of an investment, as much construction, as much right-of-way? You start building your ridership, and as the development comes on and you start getting more of the right-of-way dedicated, you can start building the dedicated lane. So we're starting to consider whether that is really an approach that might make a little bit more sense for us. I would say another piece of that is that there's been a lot of anxiety in our community about the overall cost of the project, which is in many cases driven by construction costs and right-of-way costs, but also impacts. It's like, are you going to build the master plan vision right now? Well, people recognize that there's not enough room to build a master. So what does that mean for properties that are located adjacent to the road, and does that mean you're gonna be buying my house, or buying my property, or buying my business? So I think the more incremental approach is also a way to get your community to come on board with you a little bit, you know, in a little bit easier way, instead of, you know, maybe jumping right to the ultimate 2040 vision, you know? So I would say that that's one of the things that we've been dealing with, and over the last couple of years, we've come to a realization that it needs to be somewhat of a phased approach, and so we're considering how to do that. That's what my
So as I say, Cliff, it sounds like a good segue into experiences in LAL.
Yeah, I would say, you know, first of all, let's talk about the sort of definition of BRT and with respect to, you know, the 50% corridor requirement. You know, that comes into play basically only for one federal program for which BRT is eligible, okay? And where that comes into play, you can correct me.
No, I think you're
but, where that comes into play is in the Major Capital Investment Program, and it's the Big Starts program, okay? Not the Small Starts program. The Small Starts program will fund corridor-based BRT where there's less than 50% of the right-of-way, but other elements like branded stations, branded buses, transit signal priority, etc. So quite often, I think, among a lot of communities, they think, well, because I don't get 50% of my right-of-way in dedicated for BRT, I don't qualify for federal funding. There's other programs, not just, if you're over 300 million in the project cost, then you automatically become, you know, a big start, and then you have to have a 50% minimum dedicated corridor requirement. Even within that dedicated corridor requirement, thanks to FTA staff, you know, interpreting BRT in the last legislation, MAP 21, and I don't think it's going to change with the FAST Act. Things like periodic use of mixed traffic, right turn lanes, and that sort of thing still makes you eligible for BRT. So if there's a need for general traffic to make a right turn lane in the dedicated right of way, it still qualifies as dedicated corridor requirement. I'm getting into the weeds, but what I'm saying is that BRT is basically faster, branded, more frequent and reliable service, period. How you define that within your community is really what's important. But that's what it is. It's faster than regular bus service, more frequent than regular bus service, usually, and branded so that it's distinct from your other bus service. That's pretty much it. And then there are ways to define that within a BRT project. It's a system of elements, but it's really, how the community defines the menu that's the most important.
Cliff, I think actually probably.
You want to add that?
80% of the BRTs operating or under design right now are on that smaller level that don't have the 50% requirement for dedicated lanes. So they're all being built, I would say maybe like 15% are really, it's called the new starts, they're very large projects. So FTA completely encourages that smaller level of BRT. You might have elements of BRT dedicated lanes along choke points to get through that, but they work in their operation. So.
And highly effective, as you said.
So like Cliff says, don't get hung up on it has to be 50% dedicated lanes. The majority of FTA applications going in are for the smaller versions that are not dedicated. So.
You actually said something that, you said the 300 million, that is actually, some folks had asked about some of the changes in the FAST Act. And one of the changes, my understanding, is that the small starts limits have actually been increased from 250 million up to 300 million.
With a maximum of 100 million federal.
Right,
yeah.
right.
So that's one change that, I mean, for us, that actually could make a big difference in making some of our projects go from, you know, potentially be within the small starts.
And another thing the FAST Act did is it eliminated the requirement for weekend service as well.
On the small.
Yeah, on the quarter base, yeah.
Could you
station spacing and how that ties in.
I could probably
And-
take.
Yeah.
And also the difference for some folks to understand between rapid bus transit and bus rapid transit.
Can I speak about station spacing first of all? It's interesting because when you start to do a BRT, the first question that's gonna come up that has to be answered is whether this BRT is a replacement service of what's out there, the bus system out there, or it's what's called an overlay service. You're keeping the underlying local bus. I try to kind of encourage the client to make a replacement service because you're gonna save operations maintenance cost money quite a bit for not doing it. And how I do that is, if it's replacement service, the station spacing on the average of the average of the average should be about a third of a mile. It might be a quarter mile in urban areas and a half mile in suburban areas, but that captures probably 90% of your ridership, even though station spacing is larger, because like in Everett, people, which is an overlay service, people walk backwards to a Swift station just because they don't know it's faster, and there's less time. If you're gonna keep your underlying bus service, you can make your station spacing about a mile apart. And that's kind of the rules of thumb that we use on average, because now you have the underlying bus service stops every 3 blocks, but then you have an overlay service that's very fast and frequent, that's mile stationing, so you go to that spot. I've done a lot of BRT projects, and one thing I try to advise my clients is don't get station happy. Don't plonk a station everywhere you can, because I think a lot of people want a lot of stations initially, and I try to kind of beat that down a little bit. Like in Eugene, the first BRT project went out, we built, one of the first ones in the nation, 10 years ago now. It was replacement BRT service, and we knocked out 40% of the existing stations along that corridor and replaced it. And we were scared to death that no one would ride the BRT once it opened up, because a lot of local stations are gone. Well, there was a small dip, and then it came right back up in about 3 months and just rocketed up to
It doubled.
It's 20-year horizon in the first year. So people got used to the frequency and the branding and the smooth ride and less stops. So that's sort of the lesson learned I have, is that don't be afraid to chop out stations to replace your bus. So I hope that answers your question as far as the decision you got to make.
In LA, it's about 0.7 of a mile, sort of average of the average of the other. LA's a little country. I mean, it's not the city. And it's got the largest BRT system in the world. It's got about 425 miles of BRT corridor. At last count, it's actually growing, and I think it's 24 corridors, and it's all kinds of BRT. It's arterial BRT, which is the kind of we're talking about here, as well as dedicated lanes, and even something in between that with the Silver Line. It's about 0.7 of a mile. To answer your question a little bit more, about 1/3 to 40% of the arterial gain in ridership on the arterial system, the Metro Rapid system, and answer your question a little bit better about Metro Rapid in LA. About 40% came from transit signal priority, both the gain in the travel time savings as well as the gain in the ridership. About 1/3 came from the spacing that Jack's talking about, removing, so it's more of a skip stop service. And the rest came from all kinds of other crazy stuff. None of it, by the way, came from onboard fare collection. The Metro Rapid system still has onboard fare collection.
Great. So we'll talk about the double-decker buses. So there's 2 transit systems that are using double-deckers. One's V-Transit in Everett, Washington. It's a commuter route. And they got a new double-decker that's pretty compact. The height is only about 14 feet high, so it fits most corridors. There's another one in Las Vegas on the Strip. It's actually the only BRT that actually makes a profit. That's fare box. Although they don't call it a profit, they call it additional revenue. So if you go back in to maintain the system. So double deckers is really an option. I think they got a new product out there.
So do you say a double deck is a form of BRT?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It can be, absolutely.
That's a
Yeah.
terminology thing.
And we're looking at Seattle right now, too, but it's probably not. But I guess I want to talk about the flexibility of BRT, just backing up, I'll talk in a second here, but, so it's the most misunderstood mode there is, BRT. In Europe and Australia and South America, they all understand it, but we understand what light rail is, we understand what heavy rail is, we understand what streetcar is, but BRT, people think it's just a bus, and it's the same bus that they kind of avoid taking, you know, they can, but it's not that way. Once you see the branding and the swift service and the frequency of 10 minutes or less. But BRT is so flexible, I mean, you can use it several ways. One is you can use it as your backbone system, and that's all, you reconcile yourself that you want to do BRT, and Eugene, Oregon's done that. They said, here's the routes we have 7 routes, they're all BRT, we're never gonna go to light rail, and we made that decision. And so then, that's their backbone. Now, if you have other modes, like a larger region, BRT can also be a feeder to your heavy rail or your subway. Or BRT can simply be a TOD driver to an area you want developed. But that requires a lot of significant
Like a
station
circulator
planning.
service, yeah.
And so it's a slower route, you know, but it's like, it competes with streetcar, that rotates, circulates around, and how you do that is you don't figure out the alignment until you figure out where the stationary plannings want to be encouraged. And then you sort of connect the dots with BRT alignment. And that reduces secondary trips. People don't take a car again to go somewhere, come back to their office. So those are just the 3 sort of fundamental things how BRT is flexible and in use.
And rapid bus transit is a term that has been thrown out there. Is that more of an express type service?
Priority service?
You mean
by
more
degree.
Express service,
That's
or?
like express priority service,
Okay.
maybe is what you're thinking.
That's the Silver Line
It's being
LA.
planned on Route 66.
Can I call it enhanced bus, rapid bus?
Maybe Tim could speak to that.
I could, yeah, I mean, commuter bus, express bus, rapid, but those kind of, within Virginia, those kind of congestion at metro stations. You know, are you gonna put a bus every 10 minutes into a station that is already limited in its number of bus bays, you know, so that was kind of how that term came about.
But I think like WMATA's Metro Extra service might be something similar to what we've had tremendous success with the Metro Extra service on New Hampshire Avenue. You know, Metro basically implemented an overlay express service, and it's really, I mean, it's a different bus. It's, you know, so it's branded differently, and it stops less frequently. So it has, you know, it doesn't stop every quarter of a mile. You know, the stops are. But other than that, I don't think there's a whole lot difference. But we've seen huge ridership gains in that quarter, and new riders. It's not just that people are just switching from the other services over. We're seeing huge new ridership in that quarter just by overlaying that, you know, express bus
I
service.
think Supervisor Faust's interest in the American Legion Bridge is where we would probably see some coordinated efforts to bring in either express or rapid bus service from Montgomery County. And it could be a hybrid, so you're starting as a BRT, going to express, and then completing your trips in ICE, where it goes back to the BRT system.
There's some challenges with respect to federal funding on trying to define that as BRT, though. So
Right,
that's something.
Because it's not a dedicated
Right,
lane.
right.
Well, it would be if the express or hot lanes were continued into Montgomery County, you can see that they would be dedicated.
I think one of the interesting things is this regional branding, is we have 3 brands now. There's Metro Extra, there's Metro Way.
Metro Way.
And then there's the one that's in the one DC, it's not Metro Extra, it was called.
Oh, well,
Limited stop
no,
services.
yeah, no, that,
Are those been rebranded?
those all got rebranded as Metro Extras, so yeah, there's the regular Metro
Right.
bus service, there's.
But there's been like
there's-
multiple attempts in the last
Yeah.
10, 15 years at kind of getting to something, and it gets branded as something different every time.
Yeah, and then.
This is the issue in Chicago and in LA.
Yeah.
And then people get confused.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah,
yellow
brand
over it,
confusion
then
is an
things
issue.
from Loudon, and then, so maybe that's something we need to deal with.
On terminology, could you describe what BRT light is? Is that a real word?
And actually, in the federal definition, you know, to use, it's basically quarter-based BRT or arterial service, where essentially there's less than 50% of the running way in dedicated lanes, but it still has the basic elements of BRT, which is, you know, frequent service, branded stops, transit signal priority, distinctive vehicles. Okay.
And I think, I don't know if I can maybe pull in like Mike and Dan on this a little bit, but I think what we're really talking about is a whole range of things and understanding when you're defining success, what is success defined at when it comes to things like bus rapid transit, going from what we're talking about with Route 7 right now, and identifying what's success within that corridor. I'll let Dan talk about what does it mean to be successful for BRT? Is it about speed or reliability? I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the characteristics for that.
So my background is in demand forecasting, right? So we mentioned I-66. I worked on that. That was the idea of this BRT on I-66. But I think one thing that, for good or for bad, that always comes up is it's all about travel time. You know, the mode choice model, it's all about travel time. And you know, the things that aren't captured are as if it's rubber tire or steel. It really is travel time, which means dedicated right of way and station spacing. So that always makes it hard, because then you have this nice report on planning and what you need to do, and then you hit the real world, which, like Lynn talked about, is and Joanna talked about, no one's ready to move out of their front yard, so you can put this BRT in it. And we have those challenges on Route 7, which I'm running here. When we get into the city of Falls Church, there are challenges to the right-of-way there, even more so to the challenges that are in Fairfax County and Alexandria. So.
Can I add one more to that? Speed at the stop. In other words, minimizing dwell time. Get the bus in, get as many on and off as quickly as possible, and get the bus out. That's key also.
Well, I think the question is, because when you were talking about in LA, that actually the off-board Fairfax.
Right.
So this is actually a question I have. If you look at, is it a grab bag over the, because you select bus service in New York that does off-board fare collection, but doesn't do some of the other things, versus in LA where you don't do the off-board fare collection, but you do some of the other things. Have we studied this? Have we seen, right?
Yeah, so
there's
a couple of documents that, you know, I commend to your perusal. The characteristics of bus rapid transit for decision makers. And there's a recent edition, and actually we're in the throes of a third edition that we're updating. And then,
it's been around for a while.
Yeah, it's been around for a while, but it has some sort of rules of thumb. You know? And again, because it's sort of a menu, what it does is then it talks about kinds of performance results in one of the chapters that can be expected from each of the elements. One thing it doesn't do, though, is when you add up all of the systems of that of the elements in sort of the menu that you choose, what's the ultimate sort of expectation of the performance? That's only going to take place in a VISA model or some sort of a simulation or a ridership model. That's really the only way to get at how your corridor will perform.
Right, so model all these different, kind of pull stuff out, put it back in, and see what the differences are. I think it's interesting, the question of dedicated lanes, for instance. I worked on, and I was a consultant before I came to work for the city, and so I worked on projects in a number of different places. And when you're dealing with corridors, for instance, where first of all, they're not terribly congested to begin with. And so the delays for transit vehicles aren't necessarily that significant in terms of congestion, right? But you have, for instance, small blocks, and so you have frequent crossings. I'm thinking about Orleans. We were having a conversation one point about the Rampart extension on Rampart, out past the front corner, right? And you've got blocks come through constantly, and also the way things operate there is a streetcar rather than BRT, but people pull into the neutral ground to make their turn, right? So the transit vehicle, by being actually in a dedicated space, might be slower than being in a non-dedicated space. So I think there is this kind of, we get hung up on the idea of dedicated right of way, and there's times when it's incredibly helpful, but depending on the characteristics of the corridor, it might not be the thing that actually gets you moving.
I was going to talk to the guy about the dwell time on the station. So in design, we tend to shoot for 15 to 18 seconds of dwell time for a BRT. level boarding, all 3 doors open, people come in, come out, there's a pulse. So if you have an off-fare fare collection, they're all ready to go. If you have the fare collection on the bus, you might call it the line of shame, because because it takes 5 to 10 seconds for each transaction, you know, and there are 15 people are lined up to do that. You killed all your goal time, you missed your transit cycle and the signal. And so, I mean, that's kind of defeats the whole purpose. But a lot of people ride BRT and they really don't care about if it gets in there 2 minutes sooner. They care about the reliability, that they know it's gonna be a 38-minute trip.
Right.
Whether it's dedicated or not dedicated, they know they can get from point A to point B rather than driving their car. I think in Europe, they care less about, you know, if they're saving time. It's just they know exactly door to door how long it's going to be.
And to that end, Jack, one of the reasons why it was successful in LA, A, the corridor is pretty fast. B, you know, transit signal priority sort of makes up for the dwell time and C, there are a lot of bus pass holders. So, and smart card holders, so that onboard fare collection is not as onerous. In San Francisco, however, it's a disaster, and so they needed offboard fare collection to sort of make.
And why is that? What's the?
Well, it's just again the nature of the corridor. They needed all door boarding to speed up, you know, the travel time.
What kind of headways are you talking about in LA, especially, to make it so successful?
At peak, it's about 10 minutes on average, depending on the corridor. It's sometimes even faster on Wilshire, for example, or Ventura. And then off peak, we're talking 20 minutes on average.
Can you complicate a little bit? Okay, so you've got the stations, you've got all these techniques to minimize dwell time, and then you throw in, and I don't know if you do on LA or not, local routes that are also doing parts of the corridor.
Right.
So you've got to have the same techniques for everybody, right?
Right, well, and then you have separated stops usually in those corridors, so it's not exactly the same bus stop as the BRT stop. It's usually down the street a little bit removed.
So it sounds to me like the flexibility is a huge advantage, so that there's this grab bag of tools, and you figure out what you can do where you are, and you maximize it, and you go for it, and you get a cut of it, whereas if you waited to make sure you have this, and this, and this, and this, and this, it wouldn't happen.
And that's the benefit, and the downside of that is, and the challenge is communication. What does that brand mean? And so clarity of communication, both to the rider and the public, is a real challenge with the flexibility of it. It's sort of the yin and the yang.
If you don't mind me asking, because we are talking a bit about, you know, changes that are being made to existing services and promoting and communicating that to the public. One comment we get a lot just in doing service planning of fixed route service when we're changing bus stop distances is its impact on seniors and persons with disabilities. So when you're looking at services where you're going to be pulling those stops apart, you know, you're going to be flexing new services. There may be impacts on feeder services that are serving BRT that are going to impact people's destinations and journeys. But also, these are services that are developed to support choice riders, and we still want to ensure that our transit-dependent populations have the same level or enhanced level of mobility. So how do you guys consider those considerations?
We had a project in Vancouver, Washington, that we did take out about 30% of the existing stops because this is going to be replacing BRT. And there was a woman on the panel that is handicapped, and so she wouldn't know how much further she had to walk. It turns out when you look at the station compared to where she walked from, the delta is very small, additionally 150 more feet, you know, and there's nobody like that. And I will say something about headway. So the magic number is 9 or 8, because in my world, when you have a headway or frequency of 10 minutes or less, that's when you throw away the schedule. And that's where you get the choice riders. If you're at 15 or 16 minutes, you're reading the schedule, you're waiting around, you're going, yeah, I'm just going to take the car. So if you can get your headway down to about 7 to 8, even though you may not need it officially, a choice rider will more apt to ride that bus and stay on it.
One mitigation of that, if you have to go higher than the show up and go 10-minute level, is real-time passenger information system. That does help mitigate it a little bit.
Yeah, we had real-time in Portland, and it's funny because a benefit was that we didn't realize is that if you know when the bus is gonna come, that person knows they can go to their Starbucks and get a cup of coffee and a muffin. Exactly so much time. So the actual Starbucks owner likes that because they know
Can they take it on the table? Can they take it on the table?
Typically no, but they do.
There are some BRTs that actually allow it.
It's not a loaded question, really.
No, there's some BRTs
For
that
the
actually
first
allow
year
it.
in Eugene, they didn't have enough money to build the whole BRT out. That's why it's flexible. You have to put all the components in right away. As a matter of fact, they didn't have the money for optical fare collection or signal priority. And this isn't priority, but no real-time information. But we plumbed all the stations for it. So the first year, riders were free. They just did, rather than collect the fare, because mostly students in the University of Oregon, your student ID also serves as your bus pass, it's built into the tuition. So they just show that. And found out that people started riding it like crazy because it was free and it was really rapid. And when they initiated a fare, people were thinking, well, now we have the fare machines, we got to put in there, there's going to be a drop off. Very insignificant. They were fine with the fare. They were just fine paying the fare. By this time, they're so acclimated to the speed and the reliability for a year. We didn't plan it that way, but that's the way it turned out.
I actually have a question about the real time, because kind of the importance of real time, and I think we've all kind of, for the past however many years, I don't know, everyone has this memory of being college age or whatever, the first time you go to London, and you're like, this is when it was here, actually coming here, and you're like, oh my God, you can tell what time the train's coming. This is amazing, right? But now with this,
yeah.
right? I mean, what is the influence? Because I'm always curious too, actually, with regular bus service, what the influence has really been of the ability to tell when your bus is coming. I mean, I know personally it does for me, but what does that mean in terms of BRT? How important is it to invest in something like real-time sign?
I'm having this discussion at Fresno right now where they want real-time signs at every stop. And they said, and they're trying to cut price. I said, well, let's be real, it's the only BRT coming. You're not gonna, unless you have a transfer route, where I suggest you have a real-time information so it tells you the transfer point of the route that's coming. I don't think you need it. I don't think you need, it's about $20,000 a copy to put these things in,
Aren't they now available on iPhones? So
yeah, cell phones work. And so I'm trying to convince them that you could cut out the real-time app at the inline stations because, I mean, you can just do this. The point is, you don't know. I mean, you don't need it. It's
But the point is, if you're at home and you're trying to decide when to leave
right,
the bus.
it's a 10-minute frequency. You can do the cell phone too, and it's important to do that now. No, you don't need actually the real-time station on the station because you know within 5 minutes one or the other a bus is going to come there and transfer. And even the Wi-Fi, they want Wi-Fi at the stations. They said, I don't know why. You're there for 4 minutes, but so they want. And so they wanted to put Wi-Fi in the vehicle itself. That's more functional because for a 20-minute ride, you can dial the Wi-Fi. Even bus racks, people wanted more bus racks, on the station in the bus. I go, the route's only 4 miles, 5 miles long. Ride your bike,
So I want to transition a bit to a number of people talked about the need for regional coordination, whether it be regional within. In Northern Virginia, or regional as we talk about connecting with out of state. Can you guys talk at all about how you work through systems that are looking and needing to look coordinated with each other?
You're talking about where you have multiple sponsors within a region, multiple sponsors of BRT projects. I mean, that's, I let
coordinating systems or services.
Yeah.
Where they had to have the priority for 17 different.
Right. There's so there's a corridor implementation issue involving the jurisdiction. And I'll let Jack maybe speak to that. The short answer to that is in LA, it's a little easier because most of those ended up through the city of LA, and but the short answer is make your your traffic engineer your best friend early and frequent. But for the multiple sponsors of BRT projects in a given region, state, whatever, I think it's important for regions to develop statewide or region-wide BRT policies. And I led a study in LA that looked at 108 corridors of potential BRT beyond the corridors that, and many of them beyond the corridors that they have, and narrow that down to 9 additional corridor recommendations for BRT. And The key to that study was two things. One was regional equity, sub-regional, I mean, equity, so that there was something for every region. Everybody was going to get something. No matter what the study ended up saying as far as what the best corridors for development, everybody was going to get something. And the other was define your terms so that everybody understood what the evaluation criteria were going to be. The other study that I was involved in was a branding of the Jeffrey Jump in Chicago, where the other corridors were either going to glob onto the brand of the Jeffrey Jump, or they were going to come up with their own brand identity. And ultimately, they ended up deciding that those other corridors were going to get a different brand because they just couldn't make the standards for the branding standards for the whole multiple corridors in Chicago work. And I dare say that that's been a challenge in LA too, where you've got some real brand watered down the brand, not only within the LA Metro Rapid system, but you've got multiple brands, and it's been a challenge. I would not do a branding strategy what LA did.
Could you talk a little bit about the branding? I think they do in Curitiba, so they have, I think, color-coded express buses, local buses, and circulators. Could you talk a little bit how that works out?
Yeah, so in Curitiba, they do have it's a family of brands. So you've got the Linearos, which are the line haul, more express, heavily used. Then you've got also, it's a highly complicated system, highly complicated. And part of that is that 70 to 80% of the state riders in the Curitiba region use public transport. So they're very familiar with the system. And same with the Transmilenio system in Bogota. It's a highly complicated route structure. They have brand challenges. Real-time passenger information system is very important to both of those systems, because you're looking at multiple routes serving the dedicated corridor.
So that their experience might not be helpful here, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, it's I don't think that it would be all that helpful to try to emulate the Curitiba.
Although you code like the spine one different color from what you would code the, I forget.
Which is what they've done in Curitiba especially.
Just a question, and it's pretty basic, but maybe I just don't know the answer. So you're talking about moving people, you're talking about bus service, so and you're talking about dedicated lanes. When you have an overlay system where the BRT is riding on top of all the local service, can the local buses run on the dedicated lanes and get out of the way when the big guys come?
That's sort of the international standard where that happens.
Does that defeat the definition of a dedicated lane?
Well, this is sort of something that we have food fights, nerd fights with.
So it's not a simple answer, right?
Of what BRT? Yeah, there isn't, unfortunately. They essentially brand the infrastructure internationally as opposed to the service itself. So, for example, the TransLink in Brisbane, or the Cambridgeshire guided busway is really about the infrastructure, or even the Ottawa busway in Canada.
But here, I mean, if we're planning BRT, could you plan to have the local buses riding on the dedicated
there's
lanes?
really only one that I can think of that has multiple routes serving that, and that's the fast track in Hartford, Connecticut, where you have branch routes, multiple routes. You have some skip stop service as well. It presents some funding challenges for seeking federal funding, because.
What I was trying to get at.
Yeah, because it's, because our federal system is basically a quarter-based evaluation regime, so, and that's what the statute says too, it's gotta be a quarter-based evaluation.
So you would actually keep the local buses out of that lane?
Well, you could run them, it's just you're not gonna be eligible to fund the operation or capital with the federal funding.
I was more worried about, can they actually ride in
Well, they
that
can
lane?
physically go in there and actually,
Yeah.
it's called interlining, and they can do it. And a lot of times they just do it to use the benefit of a free lane and
Right.
then jump back off
Yeah.
to continue their route.
Right.
They may not even have to stop at a BRT station.
Right,
Just
right, they
using
stop at their
it,
local stops,
Using
but-
the last thing. So, yeah.
Do we design the dedicated lane
You
so
can do
that
it
the
that way,
local
matter of
bus
fact.
can get to the local stops on the longer
Well,
way?
that's sort of the
You can do
gold
that too.
standard, the international standard for BRT is,
Okay.
for the highest performance ones, will use that dedicated lane with multiple routes.
We're using
Even
dedicated
local
lanes
ones.
in Seattle where there's several hospitals in the area, and they've asked actually, can emergency response vehicles use that dedicated lane if they had to? In a 10-minute interval, it's pretty dead quiet for a while.
Right,
So
right, right.
they can jump on and jump off and get to.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, yeah.
It's
Also for.
And if I could just add that is actually the factor that ends up determining how you use the transit way is the number of buses that you're trying to push down that corridor at a given time.
Right.
And like you say, if you've got 10 minutes between buses, you've got 9.5 minutes of nothing. There's plenty of room for a local to go through there and not affect anything.
Right, so they can get back out of the way.
As we've developed the service plan for the K Street corridor in the district, where you're already pushing 60 buses an hour through there, it's pretty prohibitive to be able to bring in some of the local services. And you also want to make sure they're on there long enough for it to benefit, not just on for a block and off for a block. It changes the dynamics. So the answer to your question is a little bit conditional upon how much and where.
And one critical thing when you do that too, if you actually have, is that you need bypass lanes. You either need offline stations or bypass lanes. I mean, for example, the Bogota Transmilenio, Jack and I visited it about 10 years ago. It's basically a 4-lane highway dedicated for buses down the middle of Cayo or Chinte.
It's a really good question because we haven't really studied how we're going to connect our local bus service in with the BRT system, and traditionally we would have probably kept the local buses out and people would have to cross the street then as they're making their transfer points. But really, if you can drop them at a platform, give them better service, and probably increase the ridership.
Well, the problem though is that if you're talking about, say, let's use what we're talking about doing in one's paradigm where you have dedicated lanes in the median, and you only have a stop every half to 3/4 of a mile maybe, and we've got local service that's sort of sweeping everybody up to get between there, and they've got stops that are a 1/4 mile perhaps less. I see a physical problem in having the local bus hit the intermediate stops and then suddenly sneaks over.
On the curve line. It's probably not going to. I mean, that's the thing. So we've been dealing with this because I think to some extent it's kind of a trade-off, right? We have county council members who say, look, if we're going to build this infrastructure, we want all the buses to be in it. And that sounds really good theoretically, but operationally, I mean, if you're building in the median, most likely your local service is not going to be in that lane because the local buses need to stop more frequently. Likewise, if you are building in the curve and all your local buses are going to use it, then you're probably going to slow down the BRT. So you're making a trade-off there. If you're, okay, we're going to better utilize the lane, but let's all recognize that that's going to affect potentially the speed and the operation of the BRT. So we're dealing with that a lot right now and trying to figure out, I mean, we want to have enough person throughput in the lane to justify having a lane. We're recognizing that that may have operational impacts on the BRT service.
Arlington kind of dealt with this a lot with Crystal City. It was a slightly different question because it's also, but I mean, mean, I don't know, Lynn, if you want to talk about that at all, like the whole question of the commuter buses,
Well,
which is
that's-
interesting question. Right?
Exactly what Joanne, exactly what Joanne said. I mean, we are leaning toward trying to keep the dedicated lanes just for Metroway. At least we need to know how it operates before we can allow local service or commuter service, because God forbid, the commuter service bus breaks down. There's no way for buses to pull around, or it just impedes service, so.
I'm just gonna piggyback on Lynn's comment. We made a decision and got funding to build a commuter bus transfer facility at the Crystal City Metro at the crossing point, so people can in fact take their long haul bus trip, say from Loudoun County, and they have access to rail, and they have access to basically our Metroway service right there on the same block.
I mean, I think this is kind of almost, you have all these, particularly Crystal City has so many different kinds of services coming together, right? And in a way, using the construction of Metroway as a way to rationalize what was going on in Crystal City to begin with, right? Because you also had those commuter buses that didn't sit there. Right? They didn't take up the space, right?
In what was gonna be the dedicated Metroway lane.
This is when I was consulting on that side, right? We did a whole kind of study at one point of kind of looking at, all of the spacing and kind of how do you manage all of these different services in that lane.
Can I ask a different question? As somebody mentioned earlier about the sort of gold level. Part of what you hear is that BRT and really enhanced bus, gold level bus can be great. And then once push comes to shove, what ends up happening is the question about, oh, let's cut this out, let's cut that out, let's reduce it. It's just easier to do. I'd love because we've on Columbia Pike, we've got the Pike ride. So some of these elements you're talking about of branding and frequency have been built up over many years to where we are today. Give me an example of maybe the most successful, where they held the line, they really took advantage of all the opportunities in that particular corridor to maximize the BRT, and an example of where they slid. And in fact, they built something that didn't meet what could have been, that gold level.
So, first of all, let me say generally that although the authors of this gold standard international, standard BRT did PR service to the industry in terms of definitions and whatnot, I think they did a real disservice too, in that they amped, everybody up on, you've got to have gold standard or you're just a loser if you don't, what you really should do is design something that's appropriate for the corridor. The design-driven sort of international standard, international BRT thing that ITDB in New York did, I'm sorry, I wasn't going to mention any names, but it's very design-driven, and it really should be outcomes-driven. What you do in the corridor should be appropriate for the outcomes you're trying to achieve.
Or what's feasible.
And what's feasible, what's fundable, what's, all of the above.
Sure.
And so, an example, I think, where they kind of stuck to their guns, and I can give you a couple of examples I'm most familiar with, is the Orange Line, where, there's probably a bronze or something, bronze or silver in the scheme. And they stuck to their guns in that there were actual, some initial accidents when they first opened that line, because some folks didn't get the message that there were buses crossing at a pretty high performance level on some major boulevards in some very affluent areas of the valley in LA County. But the champions of that corridor stuck to their guns and said, no, we're not going to put crossing guards, and we're not going to, they slowed the buses down slightly, and the travel time savings wasn't all that effective. So that's one I can think of that stuck to their guns.
I can talk about it. So on the other end of,
I was going to give an example, and this is not an example of sticking to our guns, I guess it's the opposite.
Okay.
So our Corridor Cities Transit Way, which is more up county, has always been designed by MTA, Maryland Transit Administration is in charge of that project. It's always been designed as pretty much gold standard. It's like 100% dedicated lane, stations, the whole 9 yards. And for many years, it's been designed that way. And as it's gotten into further and further design, the costs have gone up and up and up. I mean, the last cost estimate we had in 2012 was $545 million. This is a 9-mile BRT course. So you can do the math. It's a pretty high cost, and we anticipate that with a 30% design, that just we're reviewing now, that the costs are going to go up even more than that. So. But the mandate had always been, to the designers, had always been, it has to be there. It has to be completely 100% dedicated. The state is now, because I think people are realizing that that is not financially a viable project for us, and so the state is now looking at changing it to reduce the costs. And some of the things that they're looking at, I believe, is taking it out of some of the dedicated lanes. And the thing about it is that some of the roads that the CCT runs on have very, very little traffic. And what we're ending up doing is adding traffic signals, because you have to signalize all the intersections. So you're adding traffic signals to roads that really don't have that much traffic, and thereby introducing delay both for the cars and for the transit vehicle. Because without the signals, it could just go, because there's no. So we're now going back, and they're now going back and sort of rethinking, and I think it will still be a very, very nice service, but the context is that it doesn't need to be completely, it's gotten us a while to get to that point. But I think the point is what Cliff was saying. It's really important to look at what you're designing for, what the purpose is, what the context is, what the, to just make sure you're. I think going right to gold standard may not be necessary all the time. You just have to look at what you're trying to accomplish.
I cringe when everybody says I'm at the gold standard on this BRT, because it is performant. It's at the look. The Europeans do it pretty well, so I think that's part of where the takeaway was, how it originated. So the Hartford, Connecticut is probably a gold standard. It's a multimodal. It's $567 million for about 12 miles. Bikes, vehicles, dedicated lanes, BRT, nice stations. The other end of the spectrum is probably King County Rapid Ride, where it's all mixed traffic and no level boarding, just basic curb boarding, very minimal stations. I don't even think they have off-board fare car, actually. So it's very inexpensive to implement and fast, maybe about $6-7 million a mile with the vehicles. But people call it BRT, that'd be a lie, really. It's a BRT light, but the ridership numbers are high. Yeah. So how can you argue with that? But it's not something I would start with, because a lot of times I do BRT projects and we get to a choke point and no one wants to back down rather than have a dedicated lane through there, where it's probably where you really need a dedicated lane. And then they compromise, and they compromise here. Then you end up with a bundle of compromise at the end of the day. So I wish I would have taken that extra sliver right away here to make this work. So that's the story I have, is that when you get to the choke point, you do have to stand your ground. This will flex.
Going back to the question about station frequency, is it a mile, is it 0.7, is it less frequent? How do you balance BRT or BRT-like system between the needs of commuters who are trying to get from point A to point B at the fastest possible time, and the people who may live and work along that corridor, who want to go maybe from a grocery store to a movie theater, or from their own house out to dinner or out to lunch, who may need more frequent stops in order for it to be made more useful to them?
Well, the first thing I do is I take the whole corridor as it is now and identify the existing bus stops, roll map it, if you will. And then I overlay what I consider about third mile spacing and see how many connect or close enough. And then I slide those stations around to kind of maximize the boardings. I know what the boardings are each station at a corridor route. And I try to find it, even though I might have only about 40% of the stations present, I try to capture about 80-85% of the boardings. So you can see how I slide this thing close enough. So that's the first step I do. And then I can take out the stations in between that have maybe less boardings, or slide a new station closer in between the two stations that existed.
And I would add one more thing to that from a transit-oriented development perspective or economic development perspective. Overlay on that within a quarter-mile catchment around each of the stations, you've identified, what the economic development policies are, the local neighborhood plans, et cetera, special zoning districts, whatever it might be that affect the development. You may have to tweak the station, maybe move it in order to capture more economic development, but you try to keep the rule of thumb, because once you start watering down or adding stations just for economic development, then you're gonna slow travel time savings. So it's always, by the way, a balance anyway.
But you're also looking at, and I know for us, we're looking in some cases sliding stations based on where we think we will actually have right of way to build stations. I mean, the master plan might say you're going to have it at this intersection, and then we look at that intersection and we're like, where do they think we're going to put it? So you end up maybe moving it a little bit depending on.
Look at the major activity centers, the eds and the eds, that sort of thing as well.
So I want to transition. I definitely don't want, we've got a little bit of time left. I don't want us to lose the conversation about funding and financing. And I think it'd be really helpful, and even Tim, from your Detroit experience, for you guys to talk about what are some pitfalls or some things that you just really want the folks around the table to know when it comes to putting together a funding and financing package for it. So I don't know, I didn't want to put you on the spot about Detroit, but
no, I
or other things,
I can talk about Detroit. I mean, that was kind of a unique project in the fact that it was there's a large amount of private sector funding, and probably the largest percentage of any project in the U.S. But there also was, and this is I think important to Virginia, there was city funding in that project. There was federal funding in that project. There was a Tiger grant, $25 million Tiger grant was the single biggest sort of revenue source.
What are you talking about again? I'm sorry.
Sorry, this is a streetcar. It was about $125 million streetcar in a major arterial between Midtown Detroit and downtown Detroit.
But looking at funding packages for these major capital investments, I think there's some lessons from
just kind of sliding into funding. I mean, most of the people around the table are from Northern Virginia, and so they're sort of familiar with. I mean, Virginia has a lot of ways to fund projects, which is good. And I'll say, I don't know if we want to make news or not, but the state does support and does want to see these type of projects. That may not have been the case in the past. Several of the projects that have been mentioned, the route, the Metroway in Alexandria, which is extending up into Arlington shortly, the Route 1 project, which is in the CLRP. I mean, we also like to see sort of federal participation in projects, I will say.
Well,
and
necessarily.
I
can speak to that.
We do have, so there's another project, only BRT in Virginia outside of Northern Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, which is a Tiger Grant project, which the state has 1/3 of the total share. And, our own regular funding streams at BRPT will allow for basically 1/3 share of these type of projects. Now, that particular revenue source is it doesn't have that amount of funding availability over the next 6 years, but it does allow, just through our normal, capital funding, allow for that amount of funding. And then the other thing that I'll say is that at DRPT we've been pretty successful in leveraging sort of some of the flexible federal funding sources, the CMAQ, the RCP, the NHPP, and VDOT's been very good about sort of pushing those over to transit projects in our 6-year plan. And we have a program that's called a multi-year capital funding program that, until this administration, was really used almost exclusively for freight rail projects, but we've moved transit projects, transit centers, and mostly rail transit projects, but there's no reason why BRT couldn't, be funded by that.
And if I could add just something about the STP and CMAQ, because I think that a lot of folks, is that we talked about this New Starts program, or Small Starts, which is for the projects under $300 million. Those projects actually can be matched up to 80% of the project costs with CMAQ and STP. So as long as you don't exceed 80% of that federal money, you can put these CMAQ, so these other federal, as a part of that up to 80%. So there's some interesting ways that different things can be pulled together. Obviously, and I think you were sort of hinting at this, is playing in the federal space. Some folks want to play in the federal space, some folks don't want to play in the federal space, and it's very important to understand what it means to federalize that project.
Right, I mean, for two, examples are basically the approval process, although I think both the law and the FTA have tried to streamline, approval processes in recent years. The approval process is one issue why they may want to go local with the money. Another may be federal rules. For example, if you want, what Las Vegas initially did was get a Buy America waiver for their vehicles, but now that becomes less likely for a variety of reasons I won't bore you with right now. And so if you want to buy swoopy vehicles from Europe, you really have to do that with local money.
Well, and I also
And in the Orange Line's case, in LA, that was an entirely local and state funded. I think there was like minimal sort of planning money at the federal level or something, but it was basically a locally funded project, and it was undertaken much faster as a result. Sorry.
No, I think, one of the things we've learned from the Tiger Grant here in the National Capital Region is that you have jurisdictions where you may have one corridor that has, 3 different signal systems that you're upgrading to do transit signal priority. So how communication works when there is a project, whether it's federally funded or it's an investment that's made by agreements between the jurisdictions, these processes improve our relationships, and there's a lot of value that can be found in
Sure,
that.
absolutely.
And I think that if you're in the planning phase and you're considering those needs, identifying what are the limitations of the existing technology and what upgrades need to be made, when those discussions happen, we've seen, that there are best practices we're learning now that will feed into future BRT projects, but certainly we're going to have to continue to have that in terms of how regional we have to be about this.
Right, the kinds of relationships and processes you're talking about in evaluating corridor and technology, irrespective of funding sources, is a useful framework. Absolutely. One thing I would add is to sort of get at what you're talking about, Kate, and that's there's really no rule of thumb for funding at all, particularly with BRT. Pretty much with any major capital investment program, there's really no rule of thumb. But in BRT, because of the flexibility, because of the multiple funding sources for which BRT is eligible, there's really no.
Yeah, well, I was going to add, provide a little bit of information about Metroway, how it's funded Metroway.
Oh, great.
And that's a really good example of how we had to use a hodgepodge of funding.
Yes,
a mosaic.
It's really fun doing all the reimbursements for those.
It's really tough,
and figuring out which task gets applied to which one.
But basically we used CMAQ dollars and flexed over to the FTA. We used, at one time, there were earmarked dollars from FTA again that we used. We used actually some New Start dollars that were I forget the term that was utilized, but it was a type of New Start funds that didn't require the whole New Start process.
This is the exempt less than 25 million.
Yeah,
which doesn't exist anymore, sorry.
But the nice thing about that is that we actually were able to utilize the value of the land that was donated for the Metroway as the local match, which was really
that was a trip St. Louis learned, I guess, in Whiteville, right?
Very cool. And we also were beneficiaries of $8.5 million of Tiger Fund funding, as well as local funding, as well as a lot of funding from our funds at the state. So all that stuff together is basically, and the value again of the land that we were able to get our developer that was right next to us to give us land that was basically used for the BRT. One other thing I also wanted to mention, because a lot of you folks are from Virginia, is that we haven't talked very much about the NVTA BRT, and can be available in a very big way for BRT. The 70% funds, which you're going to be, Alexandria's going to be looking at within a fairly short time, actually some of them have actually been given to us.
for our West End Transitway is a very good source of funds. It's deep and it doesn't have a lot of restrictions that some of the federal requirements are. The only thing that we had to do for our BRT was provide a CE basically, because there wasn't any major environmental conflict. So we didn't have to go through the whole New Start process or whatever. So we even though we had quite a bit of federal dollars, we didn't have to go through a lot of the federal hoops, so to speak. And the NVTA funds are again a set of dollars that we do not have to go through a lot of those federal hoops on. So it's something that we're actively pursuing, and we expect that probably a lot of people will more.
A lot of people in this room will probably be applying.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that. The other, getting back to the federal, something that is brand new, well, it's old and brand new again in the federal space, is there's going to be a new bus discretionary program of $180 million. And so that is something that historically had been earmarked, or source of earmarks, and then had been competitive, run by FTA, and then disappeared for a number of years, and now it's back again. Of course, it's not known what the requirements will be for applying for those funds, but they will not be at the level of your new starts and small starts. But again, I think getting back to, as we've talked about, the flexibility in the way we look at these things, there are a lot of opportunities in the regional money, the state money, and in the federal money, and a lot of this sort of thinking through on that. We have about 15 minutes left, and one of the things that I thought might be nice to end on is talking about something that several people brought up, which is really both the community buy-in, public involvement, but also then sort of what's the type of great information that our decision makers can have to be able to move forward these sorts of things. And I don't know if you wanted to mention anything at all, Mike, with that.
Yeah, it's kind of a key because you know, in all these corridors, you're talking about a transition from a condition that's been here on Route 7 for probably since I used to buy a coat there 50 years ago when I was a kid, you know. So it's kind of the same condition out there. So I think it's an important consideration to understand how that information on that transition gets out to the community, to the stakeholders, and to make sure that they have a very clear picture for what the opportunities for transition in the future is going to be in that corridor. So I thought we could talk a little bit about how that information gets out, but also whether and how significant transportation investment like this can be transformational in a corridor, which I think is an important consideration for a few people in this room. Is can something like this transform a corridor into something that for a future that wouldn't be the same moving forward?
Well, I don't want to speak for FTA, but you know, FTA funds BRT projects pretty easily, and almost at the 80% level. Most projects I've been involved with, so I think it extends their money really do the most good. And going back to project development, the sooner you get into project development, classified by FTA, defined by that, the sooner every dollar you spend applies to your local match. So up till then, your local match dollars don't really mean much. Once you are in project development, then they add up. But as far as communicating to the public what the transformational needs are in the corridor, my experience is from a tool standpoint that simulations do a really good job. They used to be very, very expensive, but now they're so inexpensive. For $15,000, $20,000, we can do a simulation of that corridor.
Visualization.
And a moving flow. In Eugene, it happened where we used it just for the board, just to get the board to vote for the BRT. But it turned out it kind of went viral, and the rest of the nation saw it. And actually, a lot of developers saw it in the area. And to developers, that was like, oh, that's interesting. You know, I can do that. But without that tool, it was really unforeseen. We didn't plan it that way. But so once developers started grabbing hold of that simulation, they go in a hospital nearby. The actual hospital paid for a station next to their corridor because they wanted it so bad. So that's why the simulations are a really important tool for them.
I sent that simulation around. Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say, you know, visualization, probably the most successful sort of public involvement efforts for BRT development probably involve, you know, all of them involve a really good simulation and visualization. You can also do what's called a VISM analysis as well, which actually looks at just how the the traffic flow is affected by things like signal priority and other things. That tends to be a little less, user-friendly, shall we say, or visual. But you can also use a visualization of how, say, a transit signal priority or a queue jump lane or something actually works at an intersection that sort of informs the public. The second thing is champions, and to bolster the champions, and particularly in the private sector champions, but public sector champions sure help too. But if you can get a good cadre of private sector and public sector champions that will sustain the advocacy of that project over its life, then that's essential to success as well.
Was Cleveland the champion at that?
Cleveland, it's interesting. Cleveland, we're talking about a transformative project. It's like going on $6 billion in development on the Euclid corridor. But what they did is they had a failed rail project, and they laid the groundwork for corridor development by doing all of the things that a rail project, has to do, like the land use development, the specific bonus incentives, outreach to the developers. All of that is really good for BRT as well, as we've learned in Cleveland and other places, is that if you do those kinds of homework in that corridor, you're going to be successful as well. And then there's market timing issues, et cetera, that really affect return on investment. But if the elements of good sort of transit supportive land use strategies are in place with that corridor development early on, you're going to have more of an effect, an ability to do a transformative project.
So Joanna, any lessons from where you are so far on public engagement and
Well,
engagement?
we have an interesting public engagement strategy. When our county council approved our transit corridors functional master plan, one of the things that they required us to do was to form corridor advisory committees for every corridor that was going into planning, design, and to have those advisory committees involved for all stages. So we actually have 5 corridor advisory committees right now for the 3 corridors we're studying, because some, like Maryland 355 is 22 miles, so we had to split that into 2 segments to have, and some of our corridor advisory committees have 40 plus members, and so these are businesses along the corridors, they're residents, they're civic associations, developers, and it's been, I think the good thing is that we have folks that are really, really engaged. On the other hand, we typically don't have this level of engagement this early on in the process, so it has also been a bit of a challenge for us to figure out how we take what is sometimes very technical information during the planning stage to these folks, and I think they're often wanting more information than we actually have at this stage, because we're still in very early planning stages. So it's been a challenge for us. We're working through it. I think ultimately it's a good thing to have people, and we have 200 members of the public engaged in the process right now on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. So we're working on it, but it's been a learning process for us.
It's been an interesting dynamic too, because you've got varying levels of people who are sophisticated about transit. I mean, ex-transit officials are on some of the citizens advisory committees because they live out there.
And you're right, like wide variety of knowledge, and so it's very hard to structure the meetings and figure out what the appropriate level of.
I think that's all of us probably relate to being in this region, where your transportation
planning,
right?
People in the industry,
a lot of people, a lot of former FTA officials who are questioning your modeling.
Yeah, so we have members of our committees who are asking us to give them the data so that they can do the analysis themselves.
Right.
And so it's, for some of our consultants, it's been a real surprise to them. Wait, you want to do what?
So for our decision. One thing, could I just add to one thing I think Montgomery did that was brilliant in retrospect was you don't have to fight a battle everywhere at the same time. When the good citizens of Olney say they just weren't ready to go, walk away. You don't need to fight that fight. There's plenty of other projects to do. You can always circle back and deal with it.
You know, and related to that, you said an interesting comment where you said, you know, examples of people who had to settle for less. I mean, and sometimes that's okay. You know, you don't beat your head against the wall. If the project can move forward, and a good example of that are the Wilshire bus lanes in LA. Beverly Hills was not going to play. You know, they just weren't. You know, so they did not have exclusive lanes in Beverly Hills, and the bus lanes go from Santa Monica and end at the city limits of Beverly Hills and start up again at the other end. You know, it's just. You got to do what you got to do.
Can I ask this question sort of a different way, because it's one of the ones that came up when we were circling the room, which is, and it relates to what you just said about certain things you don't have to have, but the other one is, how do you phase this? How do you do things that, you know, because we really don't have the level of where we ought to be on bus service. So what are the things that you can do to phase to get these benefits? What's the thing that's, you know, easiest to do? What's the thing that's most publicly accessible to do? What are the things, because I assume that you didn't do nothing in Beverly Hills. You probably just didn't do everything.
Yeah, so in LA, and I think also the first quarter of the select bus service in New York, was just sort of a guerrilla operation. You know, I mean, they called it a demonstration. Jeanette, I mean, I know Jeanette very well. Jeanette just did it. You know, I mean, just started. You know.
Guerrilla does aptly describe
yeah.
that.
So it basically began as a you know, demonstration. You know, it was basically branded buses with transit signal priority and a route structure that Jack described, which was more of a skip stop, so every 7/10 of a mile on 2 corridors. If it was a disaster, it was well, you know, and then the rest is history. And select bus service, to a certain degree, was the same approach. So that's, I mean, and then I think the San Pablo Rapid in Oakland was the same thing, although there was much, they decided in the beginning to try to do transit signal priority along the length of the corridor. And I know they ran into some real obstacles with trying to implement transit signal priority because they had multiple jurisdictions to contend with, multiple traffic engineers as a result to contend with, whereas in LA they had one. You know, so.
Well, I think you can absolutely phase it in. I mean, I think like on a sort of entry level, you have something that's more like the PCN, you know, a lot of priority corridor networks where you do a Metro Extra type service, limited stop. You know, you might brand a vehicle. I mean, doing branded vehicles is not that difficult to do. It's something you can, you know, it take a little while to order and. Yeah, exactly. You can, and so you can do that limited stop service. Then you can start doing bus stop improvements. You know, I mean, I think you can do things incrementally, and it can be effective. It sort of depends how much of a splash I think you want to make when you roll the service out. I mean, you really kind of want to think if you want to roll the service out, you want it to be, you know, just you know, the gold standard, and and it's got the branded vehicles and it's got dedicated lanes. You know, I mean, that's fine. It's a decision that you need to make. If you want something on the road faster, then you might need to give on some of those harder to implement things that, you know, anything that requires any kind of detailed environmental review, you know, for a NEPA process or whatever, it's going to take you longer. But there are things that you can get out on the road that don't require you to go through those processes.
You should think through your brand, though. And LA stumbled into success, frankly. I mean, I've talked to reps about this. I mean, they got lucky.
And we have talked about the Metro Extra a few times in here, and I think the thing to note about it is that it was basically, you know, a certain level of it was rolled out. What's out there in the street today isn't the full vision for what Metro Extra is, but it was what was feasible to roll out at the time. I think the struggle that we have now with rolling it out that way is that if we make these improvements, there's talk of like needing to make it a different brand because people associate Metro Extra with what it is now, where the vision for it is really to be something greater than what it is. So how do we get people to buy into that vision that
if it's still called Metro Extra, it really is something better than what's out there.
That's right, where's the line between Metro Extra and
Yeah.
Metro
Yeah.
I think the other good thing about services like Metro Extra is that they serve to start building your ridership base. So you may go, like I said, on New Hampshire Avenue, when we did that, we got huge increases in ridership. Well, so the next step for that corridor, once you've built that ridership, is to, think about something more like a BRT. So you can kind of do these, because you may not, if you just implement a BRT on a corridor, depending on your land use and your development and when it's going to happen, you may not end up getting like the ridership that you feel that you need to justify that kind of investment. And so it can be, I think it can be a really good step to build up towards the BRT.
And I think that's an interesting point you guys building, right? I mean, it's an interesting thing is Metro Way, obviously, we built it in a corridor that is under redevelopment right now, which is one of the reasons that we were able to get the right of way that we did, but it also needs the ridership.
But it's like what comes first.
Right, what comes first, everyone's
Buses
saying to us,
or do you wait?
and we're providing this level of service of people moving into the corridor use the buses right away, right? Because they move in and it's already there and it's convenient, but it's kind of this, but I think that one of the interesting things about 16th Street in DC, right, where, and I think a couple of people actually talked about this whole issue of giving up capacity, right? And 16th Street in DC, 50% of the people in the peak hour are on buses. So if you're dedicating right-of-way to buses, are you giving up capacity? If you're helping the buses move faster and then more people can move through the corridor. And so I think this is kind of this question, because that's, there's a Metro Extra route on 16th Street, right? And that has helped, it was already very strong service, but it's helping to build that. I think that's
Like,
an interesting.
Build the argument for maybe.
Build the argument then for the dedicated right-of-way when you say, well, we have this percentage.
And that's where simulations.
Yeah, so like if you, I mean, that's where you can do a base and look at person